Alright guys, today we're going to look at the last section of SOL 6A and look at the judicial branch. We've looked at the legislative and the executive branch in the last two sections, so today we're going to wrap it up and look at the judicial branch, and these are the shortest of the three sections that we've looked at so far. Again, we've been looking at how the Constitution lays out the structure as well as the powers of the branches. The legislative branch has more powers and a little more structure to it, so it was the longest of the three sections. Even in the Constitution, it includes more than either of the other two branches. And then the executive branch, again, it didn't have quite as much in it as well. And then the judicial branch here today will be the shortest, as I said, of the three that we've looked at so far. So here we see the structure of the judicial branch. It says it consists of the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land. And we'll talk more about the courts themselves once we get into SOL 10. You will need to know more about the layout and the structure of each court, what you might find if you were to visit each court, whether or not the court has a jury, or does it have a judge or multiple judges or justices and things like that. But for right now, we're just going to keep it pretty basic, and all you need to know here for SOL 6A is that there are some federal courts. Again, federal means national, and the highest national court in the United States is the Supreme Court. Again, if you look up on the charts up on the wall, you will see that laid out for you under national, under the judicial branch. Again, the Supreme Court is at the top. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States. Again, like I said, we'll talk more about each of these individual courts once we get into SOL 10. So the judicial branch consists of the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. This is the structure part. Again, the Constitution lays out the structure of each branch as well as the powers of each branch. So for the judicial branch, the Supreme Court is the highest court, and there are other federal courts that we'll look at in more detail later. Okay, moving on to the powers of the judicial branch, and I say powers, there's really only one main power that the judicial branch has that we will look at. Okay, the Supreme Court exercises the power of judicial review. You see that in bold and underlined text there. We'll talk a lot more about judicial review when we get into the judicial branch later. But we'll mention it and go over it just a little bit here briefly in SOL 6A so you can understand it somewhat, and then further get into it later on in the judicial branch notes in another SOL. But the Supreme Court exercises the power of judicial review. This is their power to decide if laws are constitutional or unconstitutional. There'll be one more slide that talks about this main power of the judicial branch. But basically, every branch of government that we have has one main job in relation to the law. We saw that the legislative branch makes the law, the executive branch executes or enforces or carries out the law. The next slide will give you the basic thing that the judicial branch does with the law, but for here we see that their main power has a name, and that main power is called judicial review. And what this does is it allows the Supreme Court to decide if the laws that the legislative branch makes and that the executive branch is enforcing, whether or not those laws abide by the Constitution. If they do abide by the Constitution, then the Supreme Court will declare that those laws are constitutional. If the Supreme Court decides that the laws violate something in the Constitution, then the Supreme Court will declare those laws unconstitutional. And like I said, we'll go over this a little bit more in detail in another section. We'll talk about some Supreme Court cases, or at least one Supreme Court case in particular that gave the Supreme Court this power. Again, they have a power, it's called judicial review, And the next slide will go over that a little bit more as well. Okay, and then the last slide says the federal courts try cases involving federal law and questions involving the interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. And that's the key word. You know, if you go back and review all of the SOL 6 notes, we said that the legislative branch's main job is to make the laws. The executive branch's main job is to execute, enforce, or carry out the law. They all three mean the same thing. And then the judicial branch's main job is to interpret the law. So it's make the law, execute the law, and interpret the law as being the main job of all three branches. And again, if you go back to the last slide, we said that on this one that the judicial branch interprets the law. Well, in this particular case, that has a name. Their power to interpret the law is called judicial review. And just to give you an example as to what this means, let's say that the legislative branch makes a law that states that everyone in the United States must be of the same religion. Congress has the power to make that a law. Well, what would happen is Congress would make that a law, and then someone would break the law. And that case would go to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court would decide is not whether or not the person is guilty or not guilty of breaking the law. What the Supreme Court would do is decide whether or not the law itself is constitutional or unconstitutional. And in this particular case, if Congress makes a law that says everyone must be of the same religion, then that law would violate the First Amendment of the Constitution that we learned about in SOL 3, and so therefore the Supreme Court would interpret that law is unconstitutional. Again, that power has a name, and that's called judicial review. So that's kind of the main job of the Supreme Court in this particular case, and really what you need to focus on through SOL 6 is that the Supreme Court can decide whether or not the laws that get passed are constitutional or unconstitutional. Again, that power is called judicial review, and it is their power to interpret the law.